trade between China and Africa has increased in the past decade, certainly an average annual rate of 35%. That's from $10 billion value in 2000 to over $160 billion in 2011. Now we're joined by Sven Grimm, who's director at the Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Stellenbosch, and Lucy Corkin, country risk analyst at RMB, to talk about this. Let's start with you, Lucy, and perhaps just let's get a state of play. We think of partnerships, but of course there's no such thing as a partnership. There are lots of partnerships, different kinds of partnerships. Where are we in the evolution of these partnerships at the moment?
100%. Well, obviously, China's relationship with Africa has dominated the headlines and, quite frankly, the numbers for the past decade. We're looking currently at about $200 billion as of 2012 in terms of bilateral trade with between China and Africa, and this dwarfs Africa's trade even with the US, which is sitting at around $109 billion. Obviously, China is not the only Asian partner that African countries have, and Japan, for instance, has actually been making attempts to get inroads into particularly Africa's resource-rich countries with the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, which is actually an initiative that not many people know is more than 20 years old now. But there hasn't been anything to rival the size and the level of diplomatic attention that a country such as China has managed to shower on the African continent.
Sven, from the perspective of the Stellenbosch Center for Chinese Studies, that in itself sounds a little funny still, but this is somewhere we have to go. We have to study these things. These are very important trading partners. Your perspective of the relationships?
It's actually the Center for China Studies, more likely. Chinese sounds like we do language studies. We analyze trade and the political partnership. But the setting, I think, as Lucy has said, it's a bit broader. We are operating in a context of East Asia, and there's South Korea as well as a partner. There's Malaysia and many African countries, and I'm thinking that we will see more partners coming to the place. And it's a bigger trend of a diversification of partners in the world, and Africa is one setting where we have to get used to that and operate in that newer and broader and probably also more complicated context. Yeah. It's opening opportunities. It comes with risk as well as every new situation, but I think overall the opportunities outweigh the risks that we have.
Lucy, how much of what's happened has happened not by stealth, but it's just happened, as opposed to anyone making a decision that this country and that China will now enter into relations and we'll have investment? One gets the impression some of the investment that happens just happened, and in some ways the regulation or the management of it from government's point of view is like catching up.
I think that might be a fair point to make. Definitely we can see on the Chinese side it was very much a specific set of government policies and impulses to encourage Chinese investors, not just to enter Africa, but to enter into the international arena as a whole. And obviously Africa was a key issue for this, because at the time China was desperately looking for new sources of resources and minerals, but as well trying to find new markets for the huge amounts of overproduction that they had in their domestic industries. So this is definitely something that has been engineered with a very long-term concrete purpose on the side of the Chinese government. Perhaps on the African side, we have been struggling to catch up just in terms of the volume of trade, investment, and in some cases aid as well, which has definitely made us have to sit up and think in terms of considering how we're going to deal with these flows.
Yeah. Sven, there must be a catch or potential catches in this obviously very good, in many ways, growth for the continent. China apparently takes a long-term view. They lend money on very long-term basis. They give lots of aid. They offer to do things, provide infrastructure to help them set up their factories and operations, but also to help the local country. Is there a sense here that it's a new colonialism, that the Chinese come in and in 10 or 20 years' time, African countries wake up and find themselves semi-colonized again?
I think that is blown out of proportion as a discussion, because there is no quest for control of territory. It's very much, as Lucy said, operating in new markets, enlarging your trade volumes. And in that you have an additional partner as an African country now. So for me, that is still a very good development. What you will have to watch is different segments where one trade partner might become too dominant, and where you would have to engineer a little bit as a government to diversify actors. but that is more on the level of fine-tuning. I think the discussion on neocolonialism is way beyond what we see as a reality. If we see look at the different partners that Africa has and take the European Union as a common market as one actor, they are still way larger than China. And so you have basically three big players that African actors operate with, and that is the US, Europe, and China. And there's new ones coming to the game, and that's a good development overall, I think.
This debt issue, long-term debt, I mean, is it sustainable? And down the line, eventually, this money will have to be repaid, or won't it?
I think that depends very much on the way that the debt is structured. One of the key actors in this space has been the China Export-Import Bank. And essentially what they do is the bank will come in and will provide financing generally for infrastructure projects, but will only lend to a project where they see a finite revenue stream that will enable them to essentially regain their money. China is not in the business of throwing money away and creating white elephants, as we have seen with other donors in the last couple of decades. China is very interested in creating this partnership, but with key structural projects that will not only create a return, but also will actually create political capital for China within the African countries themselves.
Sven, I want Lucy to answer this question as well, but you go first. Balance. One wants in a trade relationship between countries, you want balance, but China has a lot of muscle. It's got economies of scale. It can easily flood African markets with cheaper goods. What kind of balance are you seeing in that relationship?
We have to see how the investment in Africa develops as well, because that will balance the trade a little bit. If you are producing things in African context and then selling it in Africa, that does create jobs in Africa and improves your trade balance as well. Other than that, I would like to come back to what Lucy just said on the white elephants. I agree on that. China is in Africa to make returns on investment, but sometimes they also do get the story wrong. They do build things that are not used and that are not making benefit, but that is probably then a risk that African governments are taking. There's a very high responsibility on the African government side to get the story right and to invest in the future and invest in areas that will generate returns in the future, so that you don't sit on unsustainable debt, because the deals will be a bet on the future, and that's on our side here, that we have to make things right and make them happen. The negotiation with the Chinese will be a tricky one in that, but obviously the key responsibility is here on this end.
What about balance?
I think this is very much a story of political diversification. I think essentially it depends very, very much on the African government in question. There are some that have played their hands extremely well, one of which is Angola. When China first came to Angola, Angola had just come out of a 27-year civil war, was sitting on huge amounts of public debt and no way to rebuild the country. And despite being in this position of weakness, has actually managed to negotiate a very favorable position with China, and has been very adept at balancing this relationship with their relationship with Russia, Brazil, the US and various other countries. Whereas there are some countries that have not managed to leverage their position as well. Obviously, if you are an oil-rich or a mineral-rich country, perhaps your position is easier to negotiate. But if we look at a country like the DRC, that is not necessarily set in stone. So it depends very, very much on the level of agency that the African government exhibits.
Of course, there are